Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Dan, and this is Gaming Gods with Dad Bods. Welcome to part one of the Alienwares Have Crash Landed, Can I Fix Them series. And before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about this guy that I have right here. I bought this off of eBay as is. It doesn't have a CPU, a GPU, memory, or a hard drive, as well as a side panel. So my advice to you is, if you're buying things off the internet, sight unseen, always ask questions. I asked the questions about, are you going to secure down the CPU cooler before shipping? And they replied back and said, yes, we screwed it back down, because obviously I didn't want a wrecking ball bouncing around in this thing as it shipped all from coast to coast.
So as you can see here, these are some of the pictures from the eBay listing. Now, this is where I raised the question about, screwing down the CPU cooler before shipping it. And they said that would be not a problem. So they would do that because they know that would cause some havoc. So I was happy about that. I failed to ask about the side panel. I thought it was just removed, for picture's sake. But when it arrived, there was no side panel. And going back in the description, it said it was missing the right panel. So that was failure on to me to just pick up on that, because I guess I was more concerned about, what was not in it, the CPU, the GPU, the memory, and the hard drive, as well as overlooking that the panel didn't come with it. And now moving on to the specs, I was able to get this before I pulled the trigger, by getting the service tag off the back picture. Is that you can see what this originally came shipped with. So it came with the built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. It had an AMD RX 6800 XT 16 gig edition, which is actually the same card that I had. I don't know if it's the same brand, like an Asus or an MSI. I have an MSI, but needless to say, it was the same GPU that I currently have now, that I purchased a few years later after I built my current PC when the prices came down. Came with a half a terabyte M.2 Nvme SSD, 16 gigs of DDR4 3200 memory, which is originally what I had, or not originally, but this is what I currently have in my build, but I have 32 gigs. This is something I think is becoming problematic as we move on through the video. And this came with a Ryzen 7 5800 CPU, along with a Dark Side of the Moon chassis, which is the tower, Smart Profile CPU heatsink, and a 1,000-watt power supply, which is actually pretty nice, and it's modular as well. So moving on.
Now, I personally have never owned an Alienware. I've known a few people that have, and I've only really serviced one in the past where I helped a friend do an upgrade. So over the years, I know they've had a lot of integral and crazy and goofy looking cases. They've also had some cool looking cases. I think one of the general consensus is, like, once you open these things up, it can be a conglomerate amount of mess, especially on the newer stuff. So right now, I'm coming into this with optimism that I can get this thing serviced and running. Hopefully it's just a stripped down tower with a working motherboard, power supply, and a front panel, and that way I can really just throw in some components, both new and used, of what I have laying around, plus what I found on the internet for a good deal. And then I'll take care of this side panel as a dad solution, and hopefully I'll be able to purpose this as either a secondary gaming machine or use this for my content creation, because this is really only a generation old. It's similar to the build that I currently have, and if I can get this up and running, and it's pretty much in the similar ball field, less the graphics card, I think I have a win here. So let's start getting to it, and start getting this guy cleaned out.
All right, so as we head outside and start tackling cleaning this guy out, this was basically one of the hottest days of the year, and wearing black was probably a poor choice. So as I start to unscrew this back little panel here, which wasn't necessary, this is for the side cover that I don't have. As I popped open the power supply, I noticed something, not at first, but you'll see here as I captured, is that we have some fecal matter of maybe alien type. Most likely it's mouse poop, but right now it's alien poop till proven otherwise. So more on that later. As you can see right here, there is no CMOS either. Not a big deal, but something to note down that will need to be replaced and installed. So now as I go over and grab my compressor and I start hitting this thing with some air, I noticed not a lot of dust coming out. I noticed it was kind of clean, at first inspection. Unveiling that mouse poop obviously will now lead me to getting everything scrubbed down, giving certain, the certain parts of the case an actual soap bath to give it a good cleaning. And then, hitting a lot of the components with some rubbing alcohol, or not components necessarily, but, reiterating, just giving everything a full clean out, just because who knows what other inhabitants were in this thing while it's out on somebody's shelf. But overall, this wasn't too bad. I've seen way worse as far as just being overall dirty, dusty, cigarette smoke, tar. It could have been way, way worse. But I was pretty happy with the overall cleanliness of this thing, considering it probably came from somebody's warehouse, where this might have been sitting for months. Who knows how long the Buy Me Now was up there on their site.
Okay, so before we move on, as you can see, it is still very, very hot outside. What I want to do now is inspect the CPU socket and the CPU cooler, and right now I'm going to remove it. As one of the eBay pictures, which you didn't see, but there was still some thermal compound remains still on the cooler itself. So what I want to do is get that off of there, and then obviously give that a quick cleaning before moving on, as well as inspect the socket. As I would expect, some of that's probably made its way into the crevices and holes, so not too big of a deal. This is usually standard on buying used equipment. You always want to replace the thermal compound, whether it was something that was just, you know, maybe sitting around for a while, with even if they stayed not a lot of usage. But something like this was sitting in a warehouse, you don't know the conditions, so it's always good to give this a good clean before you apply anything new. And right now I'm getting some alcohol down into that CPU socket a little bit, and then just hitting with some air as it breaks up and kind of blows out of there. Hopefully, I was hoping that nothing was stuck in there. Unfortunately, it all broke free and came off. Alright, so now we're going to be starting to break this entire beast down. So starting with the outer case, we are going to be just taking this off. And basically, these things don't have clips, they don't have any little tabs. You're basically just ripping the top off, you're ripping the side panel off. And I'll be honest, I'm wearing gloves because the plastic edges are sharper than the metal parts of the actual case itself. So that's why I'm wearing my mechanics gloves. But once I looked up online how this all came apart, it's basically you're just kind of ripping that top piece off, ripping off the side piece, and then you can start flipping the actual tabs for the front side of the tower. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm looking for the little tabs. And now that I found a couple of them, they're basically on both sides. I'll be starting with the right and then moving on to the left. And then there's a few cables that run inside to the motherboard for the front panel, USB, USB-C, power connect, and power connectors. And as I just make sure I'm not ripping anything apart, you know, I'm just trying to be extra careful. And now going back inside to the case and disconnecting that from the motherboard and slowly starting to take those out. There were a couple of zip ties holding them together, which I had to clip, and I would have showed the GoPro footage, but it was definitely not holding position as it shifted a lot. So right now you just really have the third person view here, and as you can see, I'm starting to feed the wires through so I can remove the front panel. Alright, now I'm just kind of giving everything a quick inspection on the front panel, and now taking those wires off so I can give it a quick wipe down momentarily. Was pretty clean, but it was dusty, and that was the call for the baby monitor, so I cut clip there, and now resuming a little bit later. I'm just hitting out all the USB ports here, you know, with a little bit of contact cleaner and giving everything a wipe down in all the grooves. Tried to make it as perfect as possible. You know, just trying to touch things up, hit it with the brush, break anything that might have been stuck there for quite some time. I imagine this thing was probably sitting for easily months, maybe a year or so, because it was just like, you know, not super dirty, but you could tell it probably just hadn't been utilized in a while. Probably just sitting there, you know, on the shelf, you know, for someone to scoop it up on eBay. Right now, just trying to hit the dust, and you probably noticed I was wearing a mask earlier, and reason being for that, during this time I had the worst sinus infection, so I was trying to get better as fast as possible because I just sounded horrible for probably about 2 or 3 weeks. The whole family was sick and during the month of June. So now I moved on to the side panel, as you can see, and now I'm just trying to give everything a quick wipe down, you know, hitting with some contact cleaner. I will give this thing a bath, as you'll see a little bit later in the footage. Okay, so we're back outside, and point being is we're going to remove the bottom part of the case, and momentarily I'm going to show you why. As I heard something rattling around in this thing as I shifted, I thought it was maybe I had a loose screw, but taking off the bottom, I found an acorn of some sort, and as you can see here, momentarily I'm going to show you that there is some mouse poop. Alright, now that we have the panel off, I'm just going to hit this with the compressor a little bit. Now that the case is basically completely off except for the top, I'm just trying to get a little bit closer to the fans and getting some of the extra dust out of there. There's a lot of little crevices in this thing. Obviously you can't get to that stuff, you know, underneath the top panel and the side panel, so I'm just trying to hit those extra areas that I couldn't initially. Alright, now that we've taken care of that, we're back inside, out of the sun, and now we're going to remove this top piece. Basically this thing has a little bit of a extra side piece that houses the antenna wire for the the wireless card, as well as you have the housing for the water cool fan that you can kind of see right there. So there's 4 screws holding this guy on, and then there's a couple of tabs that pop out the extra piece that I'm going to take off to remove, and then you're basically just going to have the full skeleton of the tower right here. And as you can see from here, there's a lot of crud that was under that top panel, and now that we have that panel that houses the antenna removed, this is where I got a little skeptical if this thing was going to work properly, just because of how dirty it is. You know how liquids and all these type of dirt does not go well with electronic. So I was starting to get a little nervous at this point, because that, you know, I just felt like I had to strip this down to give it a good scrub, or as good a scrub as I could, and disinfect everything, just because I don't know what this stuff was. Didn't want to find out or even contact the seller. I know it was a buyer beware, but yeah, this is what I had to, you know, look at while facing stripping this thing completely down to its core. I do apologize. Somewhere I removed the power supply, so I must have got that in between segments and didn't see that in my footage. But now what I'm trying to do is unscrew the top fan assembly housing and slide that through the tower. it took a little bit longer than I thought it would be, just trying to figure out where all the screws are. But we're getting there to where we almost have everything fully taken out. Now, removing this was a little tricky because you have not the stock fan and CPU cooler that would have been the Alienware, which would have went into this housing. This is an NZXT. So it's basically you have the fan attached to the radiator, which is screwed into the housing. And trying to wiggle it all free when it's a very, very tight fit, I imagine the Alienware might be the housing of the fan and the radiator might be a smidge smaller, so it slides in and out nicely. But this was wedged in there pretty good, and there were a couple screws that could slide the housing down, but obviously that required, I was trying to avoid moving the motherboard at that moment, but I think I had to take the motherboard out. Yeah, so now I'm basically removing the screws from the exhaust fan that's connected to the radiator, wiggling them free, and then trying to wiggle out the fan first so I can slide the radiator out, so I can slide the housing out. And yeah, it's a tight fit. And with all the extra cables and everything in here, I was trying to be extra careful before removing everything. I probably should have, reflecting, should have just taken the motherboard out first entirely and then tried to slide this out rather than try to do it the other way. Alright, now that we got these screws out of here, I can slide this assembly out, and as you can tell, all these cables are kind of bound to it for the water cooler, so I'm going to clip these zip ties and try to get some of this clutter out of the chassis and then further strip it down. Alright, so now that we have the water block removed, I can further get some of these other cables out of here and start removing the last remaining components and cables that were all kind of bound and zip tied together. And that way we have all our components removed. So now I'm going to start taking out the motherboard screws and then proceed on to the case fans. This little guy that I'm trying to remove is the wireless card. Those were the wires that were attached to the top of the tower. So I'm going to disconnect these and then try to slide our motherboard out. Now that we slid the motherboard out, I'll give you a little bit closer look at what I spotted, much earlier before I got to this point. And that is I have two of the memory DIMM clips that are broken or missing. So don't know how, at this point I didn't know how that would play out. I was a little nervous that maybe there was some damage. But needless to say, just wanted to hit some of these grooves, knock out some of the dust loose, and proceed on from here. Alright, now we're just going to take out these two remaining fans. As I said, these are not Dell fans, or Alienware branded fans. These are like NZXT and I forget what the other brands are. But one thing I found interesting is how they have like an enclosure for the bottom fan, but the other one is kind of loose. And this one is actually taped in, which, later you'll see my little quick fix for that, because I believe I replaced the top fan later on. And I know the one complaint about this chassis is that it's noisy, but they definitely put these silent or quieter fans in here, as well as, I put a couple of my own in here that I swapped out. And now we're just going to be rubbing this all down with some rubbing alcohol, you know, give everything a good clean. Now we've gotten most of the dust out of this thing, or as much as I could. You know, with the things that I found inside, I definitely wanted to rub this thing down head to toe, you know, starting with this part and then hitting the rest of the tower. All right, now we've come back to our favorite place, and that's the driveway at high noon, and we're going to be hitting the water block better with the air compressor as well as the fans that I pulled out of the tower. Try to get them as squeaky clean as I possibly can. Now we're going to give this tower one heck of a scrub, as good a scrub as I can. Don't mind my bald spot. Please shield your eyes, as that sun reflection will blind you. So, yeah, this is, you know, a project that I didn't think would be this bad as far as having to strip it down to its skeleton to give it a good cleaning, just because, like, I just didn't want, once I found the mouse poop in there, I just knew I'd just strip it down, you know, and potentially eliminate any harm from any other substances or anything else I could have found in there from damaging any of the components, and then give everything as good as cleaning as I possibly could. Alright, now that you see me totally stripped down this Alienware Aurora R10 from 2021, this is everything in explosive view. And starting from left to right, you have the tower and you know, the skeletal part of the tower. Next to that is the power supply and cables, along with the case fans, water block, radiator, and the mounting bracket for the water cooler. To the right of that is the motherboard, which is sitting on top of my 6800 XT GPU box. Inside that is a 1660 Super, which is what's going to be used for this build. Behind that is the Ryzen 5800 XT, and on top of that is the Nvme. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but I thought I captured footage. I was sweeping through this before I reassembled, but I did not. So those are, you know, the new components going into this is the CPU plus the NVMe drive. Not pictured, and I think it's just slightly out of view in front of the chassis, is the DDR memory that I have from my current PC that I swapped out, and I'm going to be putting in this. Hopefully it's, yeah, at this point I was hoping that it would be compatible, because that's something I didn't think about ahead of time. And then all the way to the right is the outer casing from the tower and the front panel. Now, I couldn't find the footage because I thought I did take footage of it. I soaked all those plastic parts, not the front panel part with the USB, but the other components, not the other components, the other housing for the chassis, in soap, hot soapy water, scrubbed it, and cleaned it, because I just wanted everything clean soup to nuts. All right, everybody. Well, that's the end of part one. I hope you enjoyed. You got to see everything from the unboxing to the complete strip down of the Aurora R10 from 2021 that I bought off of eBay. Part two, we're gonna put it all back together. Hope to fire it up, install an operating system, and then hopefully, you know, we'll run some games with some benchmarks at it for you. So as always, I'm Dan. This is Gaming Gods with Dad Bods, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.